Hey guys, welcome to Sewing with Stephanie. Today we're going to dive right into sleeve design and continue on my designer inspired series, creating 3 different designs inspired by designer tops. Before we get started, make sure you hit subscribe below and click like, and then make sure you follow along thestylesafari.com or at thestylesafari to see what I make next. You may be asking yourself, but where do I get a sleeve sloper? You haven't taught me how to make one yet. And the answer is you don't need to learn how to make one. I personally do not have a sleeve attachment for my mannequin, so I can't drape a sleeve. But all sleeves are basically the same because they are not necessarily catered to fit our arms super slim or tight. They all have a basic shape that you can buy online, download online. You can have sent hard copies to you. You can buy books that have them in the back of the book, or you can buy ready-made patterns. So I'm going to suggest a few options that you can do, and you can just really easily create this and make sure that the top of the pattern, the sleeve cap, matches up to your front and back bodice that you've already created. One option in order to get a sleeve pattern is to buy this book. It's absolutely my favorite book, Pattern Making for Fashion Design by Helen Joseph Armstrong. This was one of our textbooks in college, and it is a great resource. Every designer pattern maker should have one. I'll provide a link to it below. When you flip to the back, you'll see an entire section full of standard size slopers, including a sleeve, bodice, skirt, etc., that you can measure and make into full-size pieces. So it'll show you how to do this. This is usually quarter-size patterns or half-size patterns that you upscale into larger size patterns. But I cannot recommend this book enough. I think it is an amazing resource for everyone, and you guys should definitely buy it. Another resource is to buy a store-bought pattern. This is the McCalls Palmer Pletch method, and this particular pattern, M7279, is great for making standard dresses and sleeves because it has the bodice and the skirt, front and back, as well as a standard sleeve pattern. You can easily just buy it for the sleeve, cut the sleeve pattern out, and then trace it on a piece of cardboard or cardstock in the size that best suits you and use that as your sloper. That's actually what I did. Once you've traced the sloper, it's just like using it for any other method. Make sure you cut out the darts at the elbow, as well as the notches at the top of the sleeve cap, front and back, and then note it with the pattern name and the size and the date on it so that you can always use it as a reference point. Then create a couple tissue paper versions of the sloper, and then we can get started pattern making. In order to get started with all of our designs, you need a tracing paper version of your sleeve sloper, tape, scissors, and a pencil or pen, your choice. And then it's always good to have a reference image. I will be putting that image up repeatedly to show you the design lines as we go through the process. So let's take a look at this shirt. Right away we can see that there's a pretty wide cuff, maybe 3 or 4 inches, that ends above the elbow. And then there's sort of a puff sleeve coming out from the shoulder and then going into the top of the cuff. It's pretty straightforward, but it's a really good way to practice the slash and spread method on a sleeve. Your sleeve sloper should have 1 or 2 darts on the side indicating the elbow line. When those are taped up, it provides movement for the back of the elbow. And this is again for a more fitted sleeve shape. If you are doing a more fitted sleeve, you want to make sure that you have some kind of dart or something happening at the elbow so that the arm can move. If not, and it's a wider sleeve, we can close that up and open up the sleeve. Because this shirt ends above the elbow, we're actually just going to disregard that completely, and we're going to cut off the lower half. Sometimes I like to make a few grid lines on my sleeve sloper just so I understand where the grain lines are. I'm going to connect the 2 underarm points, which is the bicep point, and then mark the center. Looks like the total width here is about 11, it's about almost 12. So I can measure 6 inches in approximately, maybe just short of 6 inches, and then measure up from there, indicating that center point of the sleeve. Now, as I said, we're going to cut above the elbow dart. And so given that we have this center point, we know we can create a straight line just above. I'm going to have it end just above that elbow dart line here. And then I'm going to cut off this bottom part. Now I have a much smaller piece of sleeve to work with. So as I said before, this cuff portion looks like it's maybe 3 or 4 inches wide. You can always reference on your own body to decide how wide you want to make that cuff. I'm going to say it's 3 inches. And I'm just going to make a couple marks up from this bottom line here. And then sketch across. And that's going to be my cuff piece down here. Before I cut it, I could write, you know, bubble sleeve cuff. And before I cut that off, I do want to notch this piece. I'm going to do 2 notches here and 1 here so that when we cut it, we know exactly where these 2 pieces are going to connect. So if you've been watching my videos on the slash and spread technique, you're probably already familiar with what we're going to do to this top piece. But as a refresher, if you want to add more volume, as you see in this sleeve, we are going to slash it and spread to make this piece even bigger. When looking at this sleeve, you can see there are gather lines going into the bodice and there are gather lines at the bottom of the puff going into the cuff. So that indicates that we are going to have to open up the top and the bottom of the sleeve. And so we can just cut right through. With this sleeve, it looks like most of the fullness is at the top of the sleeve and throughout the cuff. So we might want to center our gathers in the middle portion of this piece and keep no extra volume at the sides, because I'm pretty sure we don't want extra volume under that underarm area. And you can see that is the underarm. So we're going to add volume to this part of the sleeve, but not this part of the sleeve, if that makes sense. So next step is to slash and spread. So in order to save time, I've just taped these pieces down to my workstation, but you would tape them down in a very similar manner on an extra piece of tissue paper. Make sure that you spread each of these pieces out an equal distance so that the fullness is spread equally and the gathers will be even. It's important to true up this pattern when you are tracing it over on your new piece of tracing paper. You want to make sure that even though some pieces are jagged now, higher and lower, you want to connect through the middle of them to create a nice rounded sleeve cap. Then make sure you add in your seam allowances, whether it's a 1/2 inch or 5/8, around both pieces, and then name your 2 sleeve pieces. Shockingly, this is as easy as this sleeve is, and we're done with this pattern. So let's move on to the next one. So for our next sleeve, I'm really excited because we're gonna make this sort of tiered gathered sleeve from a Cult Gaia top. And there's a lot of interesting sewing details in this, but as far as the pattern making goes, it's actually very easy. So I'm sure you guys are already ready to get started. Let's take a look. So let's take a closer look. This sleeve has 3 tiers, and it looks like the top of it is off the shoulder. However, the whole sleeve looks to be quite gathered, and then they've sewn elastic in 2 tiers in order to give it this bubble effect. But really, the whole sleeve is just one wide piece of fabric. So let's get started. So looking at the shirt on the model, you can see she's wearing it off the shoulder quite a bit. It looks like it could probably be pulled up or down. Either way, we are going to take off the top of the sleeve cap here. Now on your sloper, you should have 2 notches indicating the back and 1 notch indicating the front. You almost always keep these in, as this is a part that's going to connect to the bodice. So let's say the top of this sleeve maybe connects just by another, 1 3/4 of an inch. And you can I'm just going to draw that in. You could mark it, or we can just go ahead and cut it, but it's going to be pretty straight across. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to close up those darts, and we can take a better look because we've got that uneven hemline. Okay, now that I've closed up those darts, you can see the hemline is straight and we have the fullness added into the elbow. But we're going to remove that fullness and spread open this entire pattern. I don't really feel like there's that much need to mark this, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut right through the middle to start. So I've decided to number my pattern piece, as I probably should have in the last sleeve tutorial, but it's a good way just in case you have lots of pieces to keep them in order. Looking at our sleeve again, we have quite a wide sleeve hem, so you might decide to use a measuring tape and get an idea of how wide you really think that sleeve is on the mannequin or on the model. Maybe it's 16 inches, pretty big. So then you can say, all right, well, I'm going to spread the bottom of this. So now I've spread the hem to 16 inches, but I don't think there's that much fullness needed at the top where the gather is on the shoulder. So I'm actually going to keep the bottom portion of the patterns where they are and just tilt them in a little bit so that we have more fullness on the bottom than we do on the top. Similar to the last pattern, we're actually just going to tape these 4 pieces onto a new sheet of tissue paper and then add in your seam allowance. The one thing I would keep in mind is that because the top of the sleeve wraps over to encapsulate elastic, you want to take into account the width of your elastic and make sure if you're using 1/2 inch elastic, you might want to add 1 inch above the pattern here so that you have a 1/2 inch to tuck under. And then the hem of the sleeve looks like it's pretty long. It's hard to tell in the photo because her hands are cut off, but it could extend well past the sleeve sloper, which usually ends around the wrist. So if you want to add an extra 2 or 3 inches to the hemline, that's another way to make this sleeve look even more similar to the inspiration. Okay, let's go on to our final design. Okay, our final sleeve today is this Brock Collection sleeve. And I'm going to zoom in to show you details of this photo, but there is a seam line coming through the middle front of the sleeve, and then it squares out halfway through the sleeve and then goes back up the back side of the sleeve. And now you can see that a little more detail. And then there's also ruffle detail along this part of the sleeve as well as the sleeve cap. I'm gonna close up these darts to start, just keeping them on themselves. And for the first time today, we're gonna keep the full length of the sleeve. So as is a fundamental of the slash and spread method, we need to make sure that we take out this fullness somehow. And what I'm thinking is that the seam that's coming down the back of the sleeve is actually gonna hit the apex point of the sleeve, cut across, and then run up the front side. And that will open up this pattern piece, and then we'll have the inset that we can slash and spread. Sound good? Let's do it. So now we have 2 pattern pieces, the outside sort of wonky V that is nice and flat, and then we have the inset piece. So for the inset piece, it's good to reference back to our inspiration image. As I stated before, it looks like there's gathering along the side of the sleeve here on both sides, but there's also gathering on the top. So we can't just cut across horizontally or we won't add the fullness to the top. I think it's sort of a combination where we have one cut this way that then is going to kind of flare out. And then we are going to make horizontal cuts this way. So you can see this is a really good example of why you would want to number your pattern pieces, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, as well as making sure you have those notches on the sides, because once you gather this piece up, it could be tricky to figure out how much fullness is, on the top versus the bottom, which is why notches are very helpful. I don't feel like I need to show you the bottom half of what you would do here. It's exactly the same as the prior designs where you're just going to spread them out and tape it, but I do think it's important to take a look at this top portion. So when you're turning this pattern piece up, you're gonna have to connect a straight line down from the top of point 1 all the way down to point 11. So you could decide that actually you wanna cut up piece 5 and spread it out and do the whole thing, but really there's no point because it's a very linear design. So as long as you make sure that you're connecting those 2 points, there's no reason to slice and dice this into, it would be 44 different pattern pieces. That's just crazy. So I'm keeping them together, and you can see that even though that's going to add quite a bit of width on either side of piece 5, connecting those pieces is going to be a really nice way to make sure you have the volume at the top and the length, and that the piece isn't like jagged and cutting in everywhere. So it's going to be easy to sew. And that's it for today. What I love about using the slash and spread technique is that today we were able to create 3 different sleeve patterns that look vastly different, all by cutting and expanding in different ways. We've thrown volume into the top of the sleeve, into the width, into the length, and in the end, you realize how easy it is to create so many different variations using the same technique. So thank you so much for following along today, and I'll see you guys soon.